All right, hello everybody. Today we're in class and I'm going to tell the story of Mohandas Gandhi. Mohandas K. Gandhi. I think of this time period in which Hitler and Stalin and Mao were alive, three of the biggest killers of all time. And sure enough, who else is alive at the exact same moment? Somebody we associate not with war, with peace. The complete opposite of those three guys. This man right here. Okay, so we associate him with the attempt of India to become independent of the British Empire. Now we've talked about colonialism in this class, certainly. We have talked about the British Empire. All right, we even made a map of the British Empire, didn't we? Remember, India was known as the jewel of the empire. But the Indians eventually wanted independence. And so Gandhi was the leading figure. He was not the only one. He was not the first Indian to say, hey, we should be free. He was not the first one to say that. So therefore, that's why I sort of say he was not the founder of this movement. He wasn't really even a political leader, to be honest with you. He was never somebody who held office. He was a religious leader in India, certainly. We're going to discover that he was educated as a lawyer. He was actually educated as a lawyer in London. And India finally achieves independence in 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II. But he's not a political leader at that time. But the British dealt with him. He was the main person the British dealt with. And he becomes really, for lack of a better way of putting it, you could argue, an international superstar. That's really what he was. And really, I would probably argue, still is today. So we associate him with something called nonviolent civil disobedience. And this is interesting to sort of think about this at this time in history, because we see civil strife going on all over the globe, really, not just at home, but all over the place. So what does this mean? And again, I think you understand this about him, that he was all about non-violence to achieve these things. We don't do something violent to achieve reform. We do something peaceful to achieve reform. All right, that's the argument he made. How do you do that? Well, the main way he did this, and he pushed for this, was to convince people to, the best way I sort of put this is to disobey laws that were unjust or unfair or restrictive to freedom or restrictive to the ability of Indians to govern themselves, to purposely disobey laws. All right, I'm going to give you some very specific examples here as we go along. There's one particular one that's very, very good, and I think you'll like that. He is not the first person to think of this, but he is the person we most associate with this. All right? So that's really sort of what nonviolent civil disobedience is. But there are other things too. This is not the only thing in his playbook. This is not the only thing that he talked about. This is not the only strategy that he held. So let's talk about some other things above and beyond nonviolent civil disobedience. We associate him with several other things. So we associate him with pacifism. All right? This is really sort of a direct, and I think you understand, when you shove a pacifier, right? When you shove a pacifier in a baby's mouth, what are you doing? You're trying to calm that person down. So the Pacific Ocean is calmer than the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why we say pacifism has to do with, under no circumstances will I fight back. Under no circumstances will we fight back. Under no circumstances will we go to war. Somebody who is a pacifist refuses to fight back physically. Certainly there are ways to fight back non-violently, obviously. Passive resistance, okay? I'm going to break this law, but then I'm going to allow myself to be arrested. I'm not going to fight being arrested. I'm not going to struggle against being arrested. I'm going to allow myself to be arrested. One of the things that was very big that the Indians did was boycotts. He would leave, and again, I'm going to give you a very specific example of this in just a moment. The British had to figure out ways to make the Indian population dependent on the British leadership. And so the British controlled certain products. So the Gandhi convinced Indians, well, we'll just boycott those products and we'll live without them. Being self-sufficient, this is again, let's not rely on the British. Let's rely on ourselves. One of the things that he did, and in many cases he used fasting to convince his own people to follow him. In many cases, when he would go on a fast, it was to convince Indians to follow him. There were many cases where the population wanted to get violent. They wanted to fight. He would often go into a fast to convince Indians not to get violent. He's really against industry and technology. That's not something that he believed. He believed that was an ill, I-L-L, of the West. That is not something that he thought would bring India any closer to independence or anything like that. While it certainly was happening in India, I guess you could say that India is still working on its industrial revolution. It certainly is a technology-based country in the big cities. I think some parts of India still struggle with those things. He believed in harmony between the religions. He was a Hindu, and this is something that is going to, this one right here, what he believed in, this is going to frustrate him as time goes forward. He's going to be frustrated by this. So the question we would have to say, do all these things work? Again, he's not the inventor. He's not the first one to ever try this, but we most associate these things, especially nonviolent civil disobedience, with him. So does it work? Some might ask, some might say, well, yeah, it must have worked, because guess what? India gained its freedom. India got its independence. The British were there about 200 years altogether, and eventually India gained its independence. In 1947, as I mentioned, just a couple years after World War II ended, the British had been there for 200 years. They had not always been kind. I have commented to you in other discussions about how India today does maintain some British aspects in their society, particularly government and law. A lot of what happens in India is still done in English. But it was not, sometimes it was harsh. The rule was harsh, there's no doubt. Now some would say, you know, if the Indians would have just risen up, if they would have just risen up en masse, because they certainly outnumbered the British, if they would have had a real revolution, that maybe they would have achieved their independence sooner. This is an argument that is made. On occasion, you'll hear this. And you would have to argue, one other thing about nonviolent civil disobedience is it's not necessarily practiced everywhere, is it? It's not something that is common. This is not, and we maybe say this is a human nature problem, right? Is this something that is natural for humans to practice nonviolence? Or is it human nature to fight? Is it human nature to battle? Is it human nature to do whatever it takes to have change? So maybe this is why it hasn't been accepted worldwide, and maybe why we look at India and Gandhi in particular in such positive light. Okay? Now, you could also make the argument that the Indians get independence in 1947, and you would have to argue that a lot of it had to do with Gandhi and his policies of nonviolence. But since 1947, India has been really a hot spot. It hasn't really broken out into war, but many people say that the border conflict between India and Pakistan is one of the hottest places on earth. And a lot of people are very worried that this could be a place where a war breaks out. Pakistan was formed in 1947 when the British left. Pakistan was a Muslim country. Indian Muslims wanted their own country, and the British set it up that they got a country called Pakistan. Remember the old Indus River from the River Valley civilizations? The Indus River runs right through Pakistan. Okay? All right, so let's move on to the importance here. The importance of Gandhi. Well, I think obviously it's going to have to do with influence. Okay? This is it's a difficult, I think it's a difficult thing to sort of judge. Like I always say, there are certain things about history that repeat themselves, don't they? And you can make predictions about history and how things will work out. And that's really fun to do, isn't it? That's one of the fun parts of studying history, is watching the repetition. But there's also unique events of history where there's nothing like it. I always use Sparta as an example of something that there's nothing like Sparta. There never was, never will be. And really, you can sort of make the argument that the way Gandhi sort of approached things is super unique. There's certainly others that do it, but look, he's super unique. So it's more difficult to sort of take a look at it and say, how significant was it? I think it was. So let's go through a couple things here that we should talk about. For example, I made the comment to you just a moment ago before I turned on the camera that when we sort of look at Gandhi and the classic pictures of him in the sort of aspect where we see him in his later life when he's a leader, he's wearing his own clothes that he made. And he hand-spun the thread from the cotton to make his own clothing. And so this is one of the things we sort of associate with him. This is one of these things about self-sufficiency. He argued if you can be self-sufficient and make your own clothes, we as a society can be self-sufficient. You've got to teach the population skills, manual labor skills at the very beginning to get them to the point where they can take care of themselves. And then the most famous, this will restore self-respect by doing these types of things. All right? Number two, now I'm going to show you a scene in the movie Gandhi that depicts this, but the most famous, this is something I've sort of teased, the best example of nonviolent civil disobedience happened in 1930. All right, now I want you to put an asterisk or a star next to this. The most famous event, probably I think you could make the argument, not a lot of people know about it, but probably the most famous event of his life was the Salt March. Okay? And the Salt March happened in 1930. This is the beginning date. It took a number of days. And basically what he did was he walked from his hometown about 200 miles. He walked to the Indian Ocean. And when he got to the Indian Ocean, he made salt. The reason why is that the British had a monopoly on the production of salt. And when you live in an environment like India where there's no refrigerators, you need salt to preserve food. So the control of salt was really a control of India. And so he says, hey, I am going to ignore the law against the production of salt by anybody but the British. I'm going to march to the Indian Ocean and make my own salt from salt water. Okay? So, back to this whole thing about him never being an elected official. He's never really a holder of political office. He doesn't have a title. Okay? But he was the one that was the recognized leader of India and their independence movement. And I say this, and the point I would make is that he was the one the British dealt with the most. Okay? And yes, he's definitely a religious leader. He's a Hindu. All right? So he's definitely a religious leader. So he definitely is well known. Having a law degree, as I mentioned earlier, is very important in this whole aspect of his certainly he has a political career, I guess I would say, even though he was never the president or the prime minister or any politician, any title-holding, political office-holding politician. All right? Now, let's talk about something that he was very sad about, something that really bothered him, and that was at the end when India gains freedom. You could say, okay, this is Gandhi's greatest triumph. This is the moment that is the greatest thing. Everything that he worked for was for this moment. But at the same time, he would argue probably that it was very much an hour of his defeat. I put that in quotation marks. That's a cliche. The hour of defeat. Now, what do I mean by this? I just sort of mentioned this a moment ago. I sort of teased this a moment ago. Is that, yes, India gains freedom, but India was not two countries before, but it was two countries after. And basically what happened, and I mentioned earlier as well, the belief in the harmony of the religions was very important to him. Well, Indian Muslims decided that they wanted their own country. And today Pakistan is a majority Muslim country. So literally you had Muslims who lived in what we would today call India, moving, just packing up everything they had with nowhere to stay, nowhere to live, but moving to this territory that becomes Pakistan. You had Hindus that lived in that area in the Indus Valley that were moving to India, again, with not necessarily any place to stay. And like I said earlier, this has not been harmonious. The Indian-Pakistani border is hotly contended. There's a place called Kashmir, actually. That is probably the most hotly contended area of all. All right? And I would say, and I've also mentioned this a moment ago, I have 5 and 6, and then that will be it. India has decided to retain many British traditions. So the independence has not come without the maintenance, the keeping of certain British aspects of their time, of the British's time there. The 200 plus years were influential enough that the Indians said, okay, we like this part of British culture, we're going to keep it. And again, mostly in government and law. A lot of business is done in India in English, still to this day. There are English schools still, English-run schools still in India all over the place. Okay? And then the last thing I would say, that despite all of this, despite all of the things that we would say that are interesting and possibly, dare I say, debatable about Gandhi, he was, if nothing else, influential. He's somebody we've all heard of, isn't he? He's somebody that we all know something about, isn't he? His most notable people of history since him, that I would sort of say, tried to do what he did. I think the best example we could use from American history is Martin Luther King Jr. And the civil rights movement of the 1960s, he was very much influenced by Mohandas Gandhi. Don't forget, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Christian. He was the Reverend Martin Luther King. He was a Christian priest, pastor, if you will. Okay? Have you heard of Nelson Mandela from South Africa, who fought against apartheid in his home country? Very much using that strategy of nonviolent civil disobedience. He got arrested. He was in jail for years and years and years for what he tried to do. But he was always a recognized leader, even in jail. Maybe you've heard of the Dalai Lama. Sort of what we would call from Tibet, which of course Tibet is been occupied by the Chinese since after World War II. In the 1950s, the Dalai Lama, sort of the recognized leader of the Hindu religion. Okay? Okay, so I want to go back to this. This is the Salt March Memorial. All right? The Salt March Memorial. So you can make a note of that. And we will see this played out in an excellent feature film called Gandhi, which we're going to watch about 4 scenes from total. Okay? All right, so it's a very fascinating story, very fascinating person. Someone that we should all, I think, is universally admired, and rightfully so. Okay? All right, thank you very much.